Welcome to the Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Unstressed Exec, where I talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent more than 2 decades assessing, treating, and consulting on high-risk behaviors, threat management, and personality pathology, including psychopathy. Before we dive in, if you're finding these episodes valuable and want to go deeper, check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity, a no-nonsense guide to managing conflict in every relationship. It's loaded with real-world strategies, over 75 exercises, and neuroscience-backed tools to help you navigate difficult people, whether you're dealing with everyday conflict, high-conflict personalities, or someone whose behavior borders on dangerous. You can grab your copy on Amazon, and I'll leave a link in the show notes. Today, we are diving in one of the most misunderstood and also feared areas of forensic psychology, psychopathy, or the psychopathic mind. This episode is titled Knowing the Psychopath Next Door, How to Spot the Psychopath in Your Life and Manage Them Effectively. Buckle up, because this episode is going to be pretty intense, evidence-based, and very real. First, I want to lay out the myths and misunderstandings of psychopathy. And when I say psychopathy, I am talking about the psychopath, psychopathic personalities. Let's start by clearing the air. When most people hear the word psychopath, their mind jumps to Hollywood. They conjure images of Hannibal Lecter, Patrick Bateman, serial killers, violent criminals. But here's what the research actually shows. Most psychopaths are not serial killers. In fact, according to Dr. Robert Hare, the leading global expert on psychopathy and developer of the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, which is also referred to as the PCLR, the vast majority of psychopaths never commit murder. Many don't even commit violent crime. Some sit in corporate offices. Some lead organizations. Some charm their way into families or political positions. And yes, some are sitting across from you at dinner. Media has dramatically distorted the image of psychopathy, turning it into a caricature of monstrous violence. But the truth is far more nuanced and far more dangerous. Because while only a small percentage are violent offenders, psychopaths are disproportionately represented in fraud, manipulation, exploitation, and high-stakes corporate environments. Babiak and Hare did this, and they wrote a wonderful book in 2006 where they really reference snakes in suits, or what is often referred to as the white-collar psychopath. And unlike most people with mental health conditions, who are typically less dangerous than the general population, psychopaths exhibit consistently elevated risk for exploitation and harm to others. When you look at harm being done to others, including violent harm, they take a disproportionate share of that finding. And the biggest myth is when we say to ourselves, I would know if someone in my life were a psychopath. No, you probably wouldn't. I have worked 20 years now as a forensic psychologist. Actually, over 20 years, closer to 25. And I've worked in prisons. I've worked on serial sexual offender violent units. I have worked with capital murder trials. And I can tell you, I have been fooled by people who I thought were not psychopaths and in turn really were. So this is a trained doctoral forensic psychologist. We have to be very much on guard when we are in the presence of someone who might have psychopathy. I heard it said this way by the famous psychologist J. Reed Malloy, is if you're in a room with a psychopath that you think is smarter than you need to get out of the room. because their ability to manipulate and coerce is really impressive. They made a life out of this skill set. And so this idea that, well, I would know if I was in the presence of a psychopath. No. So something to be cautious of. And hopefully this podcast can lend some light on what are some of the characteristics to look for. And one thing to remember kind of in this context right now is that psychopaths are expert impression managers. Impression management is something they're wonderful at. They are charming, articulate, confident, socially intelligent, and skilled at mimicking emotions they don't feel. And I want to be clear here, they're not emotionally intelligent. That would require real depth of empathy and understanding, but they are socially intelligent. And that allows them, especially the brighter ones, to mimic emotions in interpersonal relationships, which allows you to feel the way they want you to feel. That's part of the manipulation. And that's what makes them so dangerous. So let's talk a little bit about what psychopathy really is. What are its core characteristics? According to Robert Hare's model, psychopathy is defined by two broad factors and then four core domains underneath it. So he organizes psychopathy into factor one and factor two. Factor one is the interpersonal affective domain. This is the emotional and relational side of psychopathy. So you will see things like superficial charm, a grandiose sense of self-worth. If you heard the last podcast, I talked about narcissism and its overlap with psychopathy. This is where you're seeing that overlap. Third, pathological lying. They lie. It's not that they necessarily can't control the lying. It's that it is one of their primary manipulative modes, and they navigate life through manipulation. So they engage in pathological lying. They also have cunning, manipulative behavior, a lack of remorse or guilt, shallow affect, lack of empathy, and failure to accept responsibility. In the emotional or interpersonal affective domain, they might have, think of a tennis match, for example. And imagine a tennis match as a metaphor for a conversation on something emotionally charged. You throw something over the net and your partner throws something back, and then you throw something back and your partner throws something back, and there's an emotional dialogue going back and forth. And the ball going over the net represents each of those volleys. A psychopath, even a skilled one, after just a few volleys, their ability to sound empathic and stay in that mode will often drain or it'll wind down. And the reason is because they're not truly empathic. They really don't have that emotional capacity to really feel for others and take others' perspectives. But they can fake it, but they can only fake it for a little while. So what I often like to do when I'm in the presence of somebody that I suspect this is going on with is I will have multiple just like volleys of information or sharing, because I want to see not how do they hit the first or second or third ball back over the net. I want to see how do they hit the 10th or 12th or 15th ball back over the net in an emotional back and forth discussion. So that's factor one. Factor two is the behavioral or lifestyle domain. It's what they're actually doing. And this captures impulsivity and risk-taking. So the psychopath has a dire need for stimulation. They need excitement. In fact, there's a number of studies that show that psychopaths don't really feel fear the way you and I do. They feel fear the way you and I feel excitement. So imagine going on a roller coaster. You're a little bit afraid, but you're really excited. It's anticipatory. There's a little bit of butterflies in your stomach, but you're really it's fear through excitement. That's what the psychopath feels as true fear. Whereas you and I really feel fear when fear hits us. They also have what's called a parasitic lifestyle. And what we simply mean there is they live off of others. They live and prey off of others. In a white collar environment, they're doing that in a way where they're embezzling, they're cheating, they're manipulating, they're cheating you into an insurance policy, right? And they're manipulating you into financial gain for themselves or some other gain. That parasitic lifestyle might be more of manipulating somebody to stay with them, through threats, verbal coercion, or physical coercion. You're going to pay for the house. I'm going to live with you, but I'm going to do this in a way where I keep you close to me. I'm going to make threats if you try to leave me. And basically, I'm going to live off of your resources, right? They also have poor behavioral control. They lack realistic long-term goals. They're living in the moment or in the short term. Impulsivity is very common. Irresponsibility. When you look at the decisions they're making, they're not living as an average 35-year-old or 45-year-old. And then criminal versatility. And what we mean there is they have, especially if they're a little more intelligent, they have the ability to adapt and shift their criminal behavior in different ways for them to remain successful in exploiting others. The core signature of psychopathy is emotional poverty. Psychopaths understand emotions cognitively, but they don't feel them the way others do. We talked already a little bit about this. And what's interesting is there have been neuroimaging studies by Blair and Keel in the early 2000s that show that reduced activation in the amygdala, the emotional center of our brain, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is related. These are areas related to fear processing, moral reasoning, and empathy. And psychopaths have reduced activation in these. These areas of their brain that allow empathy, processing of fear in a normal, appropriate way, and moral reasoning, they're defunct. They're just not firing the way a normal brain does. And this is why they don't fear consequences. They don't feel guilt, and they don't emotionally bond to others in a normal way. When we bond to others in a normative way, there's a genuine emotional attachment, which involves their well-being, your well-being, and a joint well-being for the relationship. But with psychopaths, there's none of that. They're only concerned about their own gain, what's in it for them. So now that we probably scared some of you, because I imagine several of you are looking at this and saying, oh, okay, I know this person, I know this person, I know this person, and a lot of these factors seem common, or I'm seeing them in my relationships. Let's kind of come out of the fog a little bit and anchor this with some discussion of the prevalence of psychopathy. Here's the thing. Psychopathy is rare, but not that rare. And here's what the research suggests. Only 1% of the general population meets criteria for psychopathy. Think of the prison population. Only 15 to 25% of prison inmates score in the psychopathic range. 3 to 4% of corporate leaders meet psychopathic criteria. So while it is rare, we still are going to bump into it. Think of 100 corporate leaders that you may know on LinkedIn. 3 to 4 meet criteria for psychopathy. So 1% of the population may seem small, but what that means is that 1 in every 100 people you meet meets the criteria. 1 in every large company, 1 in every extended family, 1 in every residential building could potentially be a psychopath. So unlike other disorders, psychopaths disproportionately impact others, emotionally, financially, and physically. So one thing to wonder, I just gave you a statistic that 15 to 25% of prison populations score in the psychopathic range on psychiatric or psychological tests. So many of you might think, well, all long-term prisoners are psychopaths. Of course, they're not. 15 to 25%. So the question now I want to dive into is, how does psychopathy differ from antisocial personality disorder and criminal behavior? And this is an important distinction, and we're getting a little bit into the weeds, but I think it's worth diving into. Most people confuse psychopathy with antisocial personality disorder, or what's referred to as ASPD, but they're not the same. According to the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or I refer to as the Bible of psychiatric and psychological diagnoses, antisocial personality disorder is defined by several behavioral criteria. Criminal behavior, a pervasive pattern of criminal behavior, whether they're caught or not, but a pervasive pattern of that, aggression, impulsivity, and reckless disregard for others. Many inmates meet antisocial personality criteria. 75% and up meet that criteria. But only a minority, as I said earlier, 15 to 25% of those are true psychopaths. And here's the key distinction. Antisocial personality disorder is really behavior based. Remember what I just said about antisocial: criminal behavior, aggression, impulsivity, and reckless disregard for others. They have a pattern over time of adopting a criminal mindset and a criminal behavioral approach to life to get their needs met. And that's a key distinction. With psychopathy, it is a combination of both personality based and emotional based deficits. And so, whereas the antisocial personality disorder, by definition, is going to not only engage in criminal behavior, but likely to have an arrest record, because again, you play with fire, eventually you're going to get burned, you're going to get caught. The psychopath, not necessarily. A psychopath might never be arrested. An antisocial personality disorder individual might commit crimes, but still from emotional bonds or feeling out of guilt. So they still could have some emotional connection. Think of all the documentaries you've seen about a such and such criminal who committed a murder as an act of revenge against sexual abuse, or a loved one was involved in domestic violence, and they felt it's part of their honor code to act out and commit a retaliatory act. I'm not condoning that behavior by any means, but they're doing that in many cases out of a sense of guilt or an emotional bond, out of a code. Psychopathy is much more of a severe condition and far more predictive of future harm because it is based on a deeper personality and emotional deficits, not just on behavior. There is an overlap, to be sure, but they do have some differences. Another distinction I think that's important to comment on, and again, if you heard the last podcast, I talked quite a bit about narcissism, and it's the difference between narcissism versus psychopathy. Psychopathy and narcissism overlap, but they're not identical. Narcissists crave admiration. Psychopaths crave control. They may look the same, but at its core, what is the person craving? If it's admiration, you're probably more on a narcissistic level. If it's control and manipulation, maybe more psychopath. Now, narcissists manipulate, but they manipulate for what? To get the admiration. It's important to keep that in mind. Narcissists get wounded easily and they will retaliate out of shame, a fear of feeling less than. Psychopaths retaliate because they're bored. It's a strategy to coerce or manipulate, or it's just an opportunity for them to see a gain. I'm going to retaliate because I can manipulate and get money out of it. I can get some kind of secondary gain out of it, some other opportunity out of it. Narcissists have fragile ego. Psychopaths have hollow ego. A fragile ego needs to constantly be fed by others. Psychopaths don't often feel that need because it's more about control. Their ego is more hollow. Where narcissists seek validation, psychopaths seek advantage. And psychopathy overlaps with narcissism in what's called the dark triad. This is a concept that Paulus and Williams in 2002 coined, and it is three characteristics: narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. So they do have this grandiose sense of self. There's your narcissism. They have the psychopathic traits that we've been talking about in this episode all along. And then there's a Machiavellianism, which is this sense of manipulating and looking for personal gain at every front. But psychopathy is the most dangerous corner of that triangle. To make matters a little more complicated, there's also types of psychopathy or buckets that we can break this into to understand it better. Psychopathy expresses itself differently depending on context and personality. Let's examine four major types, each with examples. Criminal psychopathy is the first. These individuals exhibit chronic criminal behavior, impulsivity, and aggression. A classic example is the infamous serial killer Ted Bundy. Bundy displayed hallmark traits of psychopathy. He had superficial charm, he had glibness, he had a lack of empathy, he had amazing ability to manipulate, and when he was in a controlled environment, he was able to engage in extreme violence and then cover up that violence. And as long as he was functioning at his optimal level, especially when he was living in and around Seattle. I mean, at one point, he was a very close friend of the mayor of Seattle and a number of county commissioners and board commissioners. So he's politically connected. He was well respected. He was involved in fundraisers politically and seen as a high level citizen for quite a long time. As he began to go on the run because law enforcement was narrowing down and beginning to circle around him, he started fleeing. And that's when his behavior became more discontrolled and more impulsive. So criminal psychopathy is the first example. The second is what we refer to as violent psychopathy. Ted Bundy was violent. The difference with Ted Bundy is he was very controlled until he got a victim into a place that was controlled and secure, and then he would engage in his violence at that point. So that's why he's viewed as more of a criminal psychopath. There was a degree of control and there was a degree of manipulation that was involved with Bundy. A violent psychopath, not all criminals are psychopaths and not all psychopaths are criminals, but violent psychopaths exhibit explosive aggression. This tends to be a little more impulsive, a little more out of control when it explodes. Bundy was very controlled almost all the time. An example is Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker from the late 70s, early 80s, and he was out in California. Ramirez demonstrated profound emotional detachment and really strong sadistic tendencies consistent with psychopathy. He started out as a burglar, breaking into homes. And then what he did is he realized that as he was breaking into homes, he began to see that women would be laying there helpless and asleep. And at that point, his fantasies began to expand into not only breaking in, but also sexually assaulting. And then that evolved into murder. And it was his emotional detachment from others based on his psychopathic makeup and fairly profound history of abuse and neglect, added to the sadistic tendencies within him that render him a violent psychopath. Third category is the manipulative or social psychopath. So these people are often nonviolent, but they're devastating interpersonally. These individuals infiltrate relationships and organizations through charm and deception, but they're always looking for a way to manipulate towards their own gain. A good example in the last 10 years or so is the Tindler swindler, Shimon Hayek. Used manipulation, charm, and fraud, that's the key here, fraud, across multiple victims, consistent with moderate psychopathic traits. There really wasn't a violent piece, but there was that manipulation to defraud and take from others. And then fourth is snakes in suits, corporate or white collar psychopathy. And this is defined by a lack of empathy, high levels of charisma and charm, ruthlessness, and strategic deception. And again, this white collar psychopath was identified by Babiak and Hare and their book from 2006. A classic example, Bernie Madoff, who had the Ponzi scheme, the pyramid scheme. He was never officially diagnosed. I want to be clear there. Okay. But clearly, when you look at the biographies and the writings of what Bernie Madoff did, he clearly displayed traits consistent with corporate psychopathy, manipulation, callousness, and exploitation on a massive scale. He knew that he was financially ruining thousands and thousands of people's livelihoods, and he continued to do it. Callousness and exploitation, and obviously the ability to manipulate. So those are our four kind of types of psychopathy: the criminal psychopath, violent psychopath, manipulative or social psychopath, and then your corporate or white collar psychopath. So this all sounds great. Hey, George, this is great information to know, but how does it help me in my day-to-day life? Let's pivot to that. Because the next little section here is, how do you spot a psychopath in your relationships? It really isn't going to be about reading their mind, and it's not going to be about catering directly to their emotionality, because for two reasons: they don't have it, as I said earlier, or they're very good at manipulating it. So the key is you have to look for patterns, especially behavioral patterns, over time. It can't be just moments. Oh, we had a really good talk last night and he brought me flowers or he did blah, blah, blah. It can't be about moments. It has to be around a pattern of behavior with you and also in other relationships that this person is in. So I want to highlight 7 of those to look for. First, superficial charm. They seem magnetic and confident, but it feels too good to be true. And over time, you start seeing cracks in that foundation. Number 2, they lack emotional depth. They mimic empathy. They're like a parrot. They mimic empathy, but they don't feel empathy. So they could say all the right words that you might get out of a book or out of a Hallmark card, or you might even get it out of ChatGPT. But when, again, remember the tennis analogy earlier, when you're getting into an empathetic dialogue with them back and forth, they can't keep up at the same level they started with because they're acting off of lines that they've seen, read, or rehearsed. And those only go so far. Third, chronic manipulation. This is gaslighting 2.0. It's intentional, it's strategic, and it's cold and callous. But they're using manipulation to get their needs met. Number 4, they move fast. Psychopaths advance relationships quickly to gain control, very much like the narcissist. And here's where that overlap occurs between narcissism and psychopathy. They certainly can love bomb early in a relationship because they're trying to get control. They're trying to lure you in and pull you in deeper and deeper. Then they can further and further manipulate to their advantage. 5, they never accept responsibility. Blame is always external. This is another overlap with narcissism that you will see. Blame is always external. 6, pathological lying. They lie about everything, even things that don't matter, even things that don't necessarily win them gain. And the reason is from a very young age, like early teens or even younger, the psychopath has learned to use lying as one of their default mechanisms. So they go to it again and again and again. It's important for you to check those lies, to check the facts, to verify if you think you are in the realm of a psychopath. 7th, they create chaos, drama, conflict, triangulation, gaslighting. All of these are tools to pull you into their web and exert control. So if you feel confused, destabilized, guilty, or controlled, check the relationship. As well as if you have to check yourself, fine, but you definitely want to check that relationship. And then look for some of these signs. And then again, look for the behaviors that speak to a psychopathic presentation. And go back to the earlier part of this podcast where I make the distinction between narcissism and psychopathy, if you're concerned that you're not sure which of those you might be dealing with. So let's say that now you've kind of done the assessment, you've taken a look at the relationship over time and context, and you're pretty sure that, boy, I'm in a relationship one way or the other, a friend, a coworker, a partner, a loved one, a romantic relationship. I'm in with a psychopath. So the question now is, how do I manage that? Well, let me be blunt. You can't change a psychopath. There is no empirical evidence that psychopathy significantly reduces. There is no empirical evidence that psychotherapy significantly reduces psychopathic traits. It just doesn't seem to get better. However, we can learn to manage it better. And there's some evidence that you could even teach a psychopath how to manage their symptoms better so that they're not so damaging to themselves. It's out of their own selfishness that they're managing it. But as a therapist, that's one of the goals I might be striving for. Is it's in your own best interest as a psychopath to not do these things so you don't get locked up. But if you're in a relationship from your side of it, don't try to significantly change them. But you can protect yourself and you can manage the problem. And there's 4 areas I want to talk about. What if the psychopath is a family member? You got to lower your expectations. You're just not going to get from them the kind of relationship that you might desire. I would also avoid emotional disclosures because they can be used against you later. And use gray rock techniques. What's gray rock? Be the gray rock. Gray rocks are boring. They're neutral. They're unemotional. So use a gray rock technique. When you're in a dialogue, don't give them too much power by giving them things that can be used back against you as a trigger. That's called the gray rock technique. Be boring, be neutral, be unemotional. Also, create emotional distance, even if physical distance isn't possible. Pick your battles. What hills do you want to die on for different arguments? Are you allowing them to trigger you and pull you into heightened emotionality where it doesn't benefit you? As we are about to enter into the holidays, definitely keep that in mind. Don't take the bait. So that's some things to think about in terms of dealing with a family member. Let's move on to talk about what if you have a friend that you fear is a psychopath? A few things here. When you think of friend, you might need to redefine what that means because at its core, psychopaths really cannot share an empathetic emotional reciprocity. Is that what you want from a friend? So I would limit exposure. I wouldn't share vulnerabilities. They could be used back against you. And I wouldn't compete, argue, or attempt moral reasoning with them, especially if they're bright. Most fundamentally, I would redefine your notion of friendship if that's what you think is going on. What if the psychopath is a colleague or a boss and it's happening at the workplace? Number one, document, document, document. You have to document everything because they likely, if they feel cornered, they will likely want to come back to you and use what you said or did do or didn't do against you in their defense. So document your interactions. Document what you shared with them, what you did with them, what projects you're working on. I know that's burdensome, but you've got to protect yourself. Number two, communicate in writing. You want a paper trail of these interactions so they can't be spun and used against you. Number three, set extremely clear boundaries for both work and even contact after work, especially if it's a boss. You're going to have to set clear boundaries. Four, never show emotional frustration. I know you're human. You're going to have some moments of this, but as much as you can, limit displays of emotional frustration because it fuels them. It fuels them in two ways. One way is when they see they're getting under your skin, they know they have the ability, they know they have a trigger, they know they have a hook, and they can manipulate that. The other thing is psychopaths love it when they can get under your skin because it lets them know that they're getting control. They love being successfully manipulative. Don't give them that. The fourth category is what if psychopathy is a romantic partner, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a spouse? This one's tough, but there's things you can do. One is leave. I know that's rough, but like leave. You're not going to change them. You can manage them. But the question for you is, do you want to be in a romantic partnership for the rest of your life with somebody that you have to manage that fundamentally is going to struggle with their capacity to be in a reciprocal emotional relationship? Go no contact. Block communication. I often recommend to people I'm coaching to engage in professional or legal support. I do help some people in my coaching programs navigate these types of relationships, but it's not uncommon that I refer them out to therapy. And even though as a clinical and forensic psychologist, I do therapy myself, I don't do coaching and therapy at the same time with the same person. So I will refer them out and say, you need to do a deeper dive in terms of the patterns here, right? But engage professional assistance as you need. The legal piece is if you're entangled. Maybe you bought a house together. Maybe it's a divorce process. Get legal representation and support so you got the proper guidance to protect yourself because psychopaths can also be very manipulative legally. And psychopaths do not change through love or insight or therapy or pleading. You cannot love them into being different. You can't be understanding enough for them to change. Not going to work. You can't win a game where the other player doesn't play by the rules. So the only winning move in this type of relationship is exit. All right, let me give you some closing reflections. This has been a good chunk of time here. Psychopathy is one of the most dangerous personality structures because of one main reason. It's that they harm without conscience and without remorse. But here's the thing, knowledge, your knowledge, and that's why I'm doing this episode, your knowledge is protection. Clarity is power. Boundaries become a survival mechanism. So whether the psychopath in your life is a boss, a sibling, a neighbor, or a romantic partner, your job is not to fix them. You got to get off of that. And if you've got some kind of healing complex or savior complex where you go through relationship after relationship helping people or saving them, and you're in with a psychopath, you have seriously need to take a look at that because it's not going to work. Your job instead is to preserve your safety, sanity, and sense of self. All right. If today's episode hit home and you're ready to move from insight to action, I highly recommend check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer: From Conflict to Clarity, a no nonsense guide to changing every relationship. This isn't fluff. It is practical, a no BS guide designed to help you break reactive cycles, strengthen emotional boundaries, and navigate difficult relationships with clarity and confidence. It has practical use, 75 exercises to help you work through these actual issues, to do the actual work, come out on the other side with insight and clarity and a clear blueprint and roadmap for navigating forward. It's now available on Amazon. Search for The Conflict Whisperer, and I'll also leave a link in the show notes. As always, thank you for being here, for doing the work, and for choosing to be the calm in the storm. Now, a call to action. Insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn awareness into movement and stress into strategy, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. Reach out to set up a free consultation. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Let's create real momentum starting now. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias, The Unstressed Exec. Thanks for listening. See you soon. And remember, shift happens.